Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
Hi everybody, sorry to interrupt the music, but welcome everyone to the first TWT Policy Lab of 2020. We're just going to start with a quick note from Hilary Wainwright about the very sad news of David Graeber's death. David Graeber is an activist and scholar really close to the politics of TWT, so we thought we'd just say a few words about that very sad news before we start the main proceedings this evening.
Well, I mean, I can't really do justice to David. I mean, I'm still absorbing the shock. I mean, he was almost like part of the family because he was a real sort of movement intellectual in the sense that he offered his ideas as a kind of resource, you know, as tools for others to work with. But more than that, he was a really kind and modest and genuinely comradely and sisterly, brotherly individual, a human being. And so he was always around at TWT events, always, you know, helping people, chatting to people, encouraging. He's a very encouraging, empowering sort of person. So he kind of, you know, he must carry on in a way as an inspiration to us. And I think the discussion about municipal socialism is in part about forms of empowerment. How can the state and political institutions be not forms of domination, but forms of resources for our movement, for movements, for transformation? And I think that's very much in David's spirit. I mean, whether or not the state can do that is another question, and probably one I might disagree with David on that. But certainly, I think his spirit and his work will continue to influence us and inspire us. So it's in a kind of feeling of mourning and grief and loss, but also, you know, we must celebrate and make use of his work and his legacy in the way that I'm sure he would have wanted us to do.
Thanks for that, Hilary. It's been really sad news. I saw him on more demonstrations than almost any other intellectual I can think of, and his work has always been really inspiring to me. So I hope that this will be an opportunity for new people to learn about his work and to draw on it. So I just want to take a minute to introduce the idea of these policy labs and to say something about how today is going to be structured before I introduce our 5 fantastic speakers for this evening. So 2019 marked our first experiment with these policy labs. We were convinced that we could use the knowledge, the experience, the intelligence of members of the public to formulate policy across a range of different policy areas. And last year we ended up producing a manifesto for the movement, which covered everything from education to the NHS, crime, drug policy, mental health, the media. The manifesto is still available online, and I would really encourage you all to have a look at it if you haven't already. But we also saw last year as a kind of proof of concept. So we created template documents to enable people to run their own policy labs in their local community group or local Labour Party. And we've seen some fantastic spin-offs using these resources, including Bristol Transformed earlier in the year. And that's another thing, we'd really encourage people to do their own policy labs, particularly with local elections coming up next year across the country. But for the TWT festival this year, with the general election not likely for at least another 4 years, we thought we'd do things a little differently. So rather than coming up with a document full of election-ready policy ideas, we wanted to take the time to explore a few big themes. So these are themes which we often hear as slogans, but which aren't always fleshed out or turned into practical policy proposals. So this year we're focusing on 2 topics: municipal socialism, which is today's session, and abolishing the police. And so for each of these, we're going to have 2 sessions which kind of build on each other. So today is the introductory workshop on municipal socialism, and we're going to be exploring a set of different ideas within the theme of municipal socialism. And then at the end of this session, we're going to have a vote on what area we think we should concentrate on for a more in-depth policy workshop in 2 weeks' time. But rather than just hearing from experts, I'm really keen for these policy labs to be participatory, collaborative spaces where you can use your own ideas and experiences to think about what municipal socialism might mean in your own local area. So we're going to start with an overview of these different policy areas, and then we're going to split you up into breakout groups where you'll be able to reflect on how these different ideas speak to your lived experience, where you think the left should be putting its strategic energy before the local elections next year, and which ideas you can imagine transforming your local community. So one last thing before I introduce our speakers. This is, like I said, a collaborative space, and people may share things that are intimate or personal. So please respect the confidentiality of your fellow participants. This is also a space where everyone's opinions are valued. So I'm sure there'll be lots of things we disagree on, but please keep your disagreements comradely and ensure that this is a safe and welcoming space for everyone. So that's about all by way of background. I'm now going to introduce our fabulous speakers and then we'll get started. So we're going to begin with an overview of the past and present of municipal socialism from Hilary Wainwright, who's the co-founder and editor of Red Pepper magazine, a lifelong socialist and feminist campaigner, and kind of most interestingly for today's discussion was Ken Livingstone's deputy chief economic advisor to the Greater London Council during the 1980s, where she worked particularly on different ways of democratizing economic policy making. We'll then hear from Lynn Seagal on social care and how municipal socialists should be thinking about the politics of care. Lynn is Professor of Psychology and Gender Studies at Birkbeck University, and she's the author of too many books to mention, but recently she's been working with a group called the Care Collective, who are producing a care manifesto, which will be coming out, I think, later this year with Verso Press. We'll then also hear from Councillor Matt Brown, who's the leader of Preston Council, who will speak to us about community wealth building. Matt is the lead architect of the now famous Preston model of local economic development and a hugely influential figure in local government. Joe Billsborough will then speak to us about transport, which is another key element of local government responsibility. Joe's a researcher at the Centre for Local Economic Studies, and before that worked at the Democracy Collaborative, two pioneering organisations in the field of localism and municipalism. And finally, we'll hear from Alessio Colliolis, who's a teaching fellow at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit and who specialises in the nighttime economy, something which feels quite far away from all of us right now, but which I, for one, really hope comes back soon. Okay, so thanks in advance to all our speakers and to all of you for attending. I'll now let Hilary introduce us to the past and present of municipal socialism. We've got quite a lot to get through, and I want to leave, like I said, as much time as possible for participation. So I'll be quite firm with the timing. So apologies in advance to our speakers. But you've got 10 minutes, Hilary. Take it away.
Well, I'll be quick. And rather than talk very much myself, I'll also point to a very good resource on the history of Labour and municipal socialism, which is a piece, very good piece in New Socialist by Tom Blackburn called The Capacity to Imagine. So go there for the details, and I'll just give you some sort of headlines, as it were, in 10 minutes. So, I mean, in general, I'd say that the history of municipal socialism in the UK, and obviously in a sense for our discussions, we don't want to limit ourselves to the UK. There's a lot to learn from experiences internationally. And maybe I'll just mention two that you should look up. One is the whole experience of participatory budgeting in Latin America, and in particular to Porto Alegre, which, I mean, sometimes has been romanticized and has got a lot of limits and problems, but was basically a very radical idea of sharing power. The key thing was not, consultation, was not local government drawing up its plans, its budget, and then saying, okay, people, what do you think? And then sort of going ahead almost regardless of what people thought. But actually, in a way, opening up the black box of local government finance and saying, okay, what are your priorities? And then having a sort of genuinely participative process where local people decided their priorities, which then were influencing the local council. So it's a very radical experiment, which has been kind of weakened in many ways, not only in Brazil itself, obviously, completely eliminated by Bolsonaro, but even under Lula, it wasn't really followed through. But some of these ideas have been taken up in Britain at different times, and the rhetoric of participation and participatory budgeting has been used, but actually not been about really sharing public resources. So anyway, the Brazilian experience is interesting. Another one is the whole experience in Barcelona of Barcelona en Comú, which again is worth looking up, where you had a really radical alliance that wasn't a party alliance. It was a civic-driven alliance in which some radical parties played an important role, but it was basically driven by social movements, in particular social movement against housing evictions, which was led by Ada Colau, who then became and is still the mayor of Barcelona. So I just mentioned those examples so that although my what's probably now 6 minutes left, I'll be headlining what's happened in Britain. Don't restrict your sort of drawing of an inspiration from around municipal socialism to Britain. So the experience in Britain has been kind of contradictory. On the one hand, local government has been a laboratory for radical socialist policies that have been later pursued at a national level. So public ownership had a lot of its first experiences and experimentations locally with municipal bus services, even the health service, in a way. Nye Bevan got his first ideas from the local experience in Tredegar, where he lived, which was a mixture of a union-based sort of mutual help sort of health facility with some support from local government, ideas around municipal bus services and so on, all had their sources in experiments in local government. Similarly, redistribution of public funds with the Poplar experiment. So on the one hand, it's been that sort of radicalism, and I'll talk maybe a bit more about the GLC in like 2 minutes. But on the other hand, it's also been a kind of site of, if you like, the sort of purely careerist side of the Labour Party. You know, people simply wanting office either for their own sort of status aggrandizement, or, you know, sometimes for more corrupt sort of nepotistic, or sorts of, you know, doing deals with private companies. But the history has been kind of, initially it was more of a space for radical experimentation, and it was only when Labour became a party of government after the war that, in a sense, local government became a more conservative sort of institution, where basically local councils were, rather than being sources of opposition to the national government, were really ways of managing national government policy at a local level. And often with all the energy of the party, the Labour Party, and particularly the left in the party, being focused on national issues, the sort of level of the party at a local level, in local government, was very weak. And so council officers became more and more powerful, and that often became a source of corruption. So local government's got a sort of a right-wing sort of technocratic, apolitical tradition to it, but it also has a radical tradition which, you know, goes back to pre-Second World War, particularly with George Lansbury in Poplar, but then reappears in a sense post Callaghan, post the sort of defeats of Tony Benn and the left in the Labour Party, where in a way the left in the Labour Party had been defeated, but actually there was still a lot of radicalism in society and in social movements. And the Greater London Council and the left's control of that was a kind of way in which that gained political expression that it could not gain at a national level, or way after it had been defeated at a national level. So I think the GLC is an interesting experiment. That the problem with local government is that it's easily crushed. I mean, it's an area of experiment, but because it is local, and in a way Britain is a very centralised country in which the Westminster government, I won't say the national because Scotland and Wales are also national, nations, but the Westminster government is highly centralised, and its finances through the Treasury and so on are highly centralised, and they're able to basically crush, as they did with the GLC, abolish, you know, because we've got no democratic constitution, the GLC. So it's full of ideas which I think are still worth studying and reclaiming for any attempt to revive municipal socialism. And the one idea I would quickly dwell on in my remaining 3 minutes or so is the idea of local government as an instrument of economic transformation, and transformation not through the institution of the state itself, and that here David Graeber would agree, but more through the state supporting the initiatives and the creativity of social movements. So although Matteo says I was the assistant chief economic advisor to Ken Livingstone, actually what I did with many others was to coordinate and organize a unit called the Popular Planning Unit. And our work was actually more like community organizing, but with the backing of the public, the resources of a state in which the political leadership was not party, it wasn't a tribal party leadership. I mean, I wasn't in the Labour Party. Sheila Rowbotham, who was one of the members of the Popular Planning Unit, wasn't in the Labour Party. Ken Livingstone never asked us for our party cards. We were there because we shared the same sort of vision and policies. And those policies were very much based on the GLC supporting social movements. And in particular, seeing economics as a site of seeing production as a site of transformation. So basically, because it links very much to Matt's work in Preston, and in a way to Lynn's work on care, because it was saying that local governments must be sources of support for transformation within the economy. And we saw domestic labour as key, and care as a key part of our vision of the economy, because we were trying to shift the idea of production as being away from what we called militarized production driven by private corporations, basically organizing factories and production as almost military in the degree of control, and actually, you know, more often than not, linking production to military production, to the idea of socially useful production. So production and economic activity for social use. So care was key to that idea of an economy based on social need. And the other dimension of that was actually recognizing that the creativity to meet social need was in, you know, within labour itself, and labour linked to communities and those that were using, in a way, the benefits of labour. So we were trying to use the GLC. Sorry, got a bit of a throat. Use the GLC to facilitate economic change in society, and I think that's very linked to what Matt's trying to do with community wealth building. So I think local government, I mean, less and less now because it's been so decimated, but maybe even now, as Matt will probably explain, there are powers, all sorts of powers which have never been used in a transformative way, like purchasing powers, like land. You know, local authorities have a lot of land. They can influence the organisation of care, and so we should look at local authorities as a resource for the kind of social transformation that we as movements are trying to develop. So from a policy workshop point of view, I'd say it's really important to be thinking about policy, not in terms of what do we think local government can solve and see them in a paternalistic way as solving our problems, but more how can they support the ideas and initiatives that are coming from organised social movements. So I'll end there. I hope I've stuck within my 10 minutes. And I might have to go early, sorry.
Thank you, Hilary. No, that was fantastic. Really useful to see you setting out some of the contradictions in local government, both the experimentation and the radicalism, but also the petty conservatism and the corruption, to be honest, which is often characterized British local government. So that was a kind of big overview. And what we're going to do now is we're going to hear from 4 speakers who are going to do much more specific analysis of what possibilities and potentials there are for municipal socialism in different areas, different policy areas. So we're going to start with Professor Lynn Seagal, who's going to speak to us about care, social care, and the politics of care. So I'm going to just 5 minutes, if that's okay, Lynn.
So Hilary and I go back a very long way together with Sheila Rowbottom when we published Beyond the Fragments. And so I want to begin by saying that we second wave feminists, as I am, where I came into politics, almost all began as community activists working on a million different issues at once. So I'll be talking about municipal socialism in terms of care. And I'll say that I see municipal socialism as the attempts to create caring, livable institutions and spaces, ones which we can all feel in some sense a part of, where we can all feel able to be heard and valued, and above all, cared for, and able to care for each other in the most creative ways possible. And that's something which is just so very difficult today. So as Matteo said, I am one of the authors of the Care Manifesto, which you can see back the front here, which will be published by Verso, not later in the year, but in 2 weeks' time. And what the manifesto addresses is the multiple crises of care in our time, the profound carelessness, which we simply see all around us, from the most local to the global. And we saw all that long before COVID. So now this current crisis has come about, this current crisis of care has come about, as you all know, through decades, actually 40 years of neoliberal policies prioritizing profit over people. Years of austerity, deregulation, and privatization of so many caring facilities have all accompanied a rationale of the continuing devaluation of care work itself. So this is what's diminished the ability of neoliberal states, especially countries such as the US, the UK, and Brazil, to cope in any way adequately or effectively with the spread of COVID-19, not to mention allowing a type of criminal neglect to occur in the care homes, the so-called care homes for the elderly, almost all of whom, of course, had been privatized, such as the 2 very near where I live, where many patients died and staff too died. That's in Islington. So in our manifesto, what we do is try and describe all the way in which what ties together the contempt and devaluation, what ties all this together is the contempt and devaluation of so-called dependency, especially of anyone in need of state support. And that's something that Thatcher explicitly encouraged, a framing which has really continued to this day, the framing of dependency almost as a type of pathology. And we see this, of course, in the mainstream media's vilification of all those on benefits. You think of benefit streets, but everywhere really, and the complete disavowal of all the ways in which, in one way and another, we are all dependent all our lives from birth to grave on each other, and above all on the social infrastructures of care. We depend on transport, education, everything around us is necessary for our very survival. So we tackle this issue of so-called dependency and so-called autonomy by analyzing them as 2 sides of the very same coin. You don't have autonomy without your needs, your dependent needs being met, and vice versa. Also, the this manifesto begins with a very expansive notion of care. So we draw upon all the leading scholars of care, like Joan Tronto and others, to suggest that care isn't just hands-on care, which is where municipal socialism comes in, but it also involves caring for and caring about, being able to care for and care about each other. So all the ways in which we're able to live in a sustainable world, both locally and globally. So this is located in all the descriptions of what we need to stay alive. What we need to stay alive is to improve the basic infrastructures around us, which of course should be the job of municipalism, but precisely what's made harder and harder by local councils being clobbered all the time, losing funding, losing resources, forced to sell off resources at the very same time as more responsibility is placed upon them to create healthy communities. So we also discuss in the manifesto how and why caring work, both paid and unpaid, has been so routinely exploited. And that, of course, relates to its classic gendered dimension, but also, and in particular of late, but going back quite a long time, to its racialized dimensions. Those providing the services we most rely upon have been so often the least respected and least rewarded, women and Black and ethnic minorities. So also the skills for caring, the skill of caring itself has been simply disavowed. And so that's connected with why we have such a crisis of care, such low pay for carers, such lack of continuity for those providing care, as well as in our own lives, even at home, not having the time or resources to be able to care for our children, for our elderly relatives, for our neighbors. All that is something which, if we had any adequate sort of municipal socialism, then it would be much easier to provide the necessary and essential care we all need. But I also think it's important to realize that care and our own and other people's dependency does generate tension and ambivalence and conflict. You know, we don't like to see ourselves as dependent, partly because of all the ways in which we're told we should be independent and resourceful. And so having to take responsibility for others can be quite difficult and trying, which again is all the more reason why we have to have local resources, the resources of forms of municipal socialism that can enable us, you know, to be confident that we actually have the skills and ability to care and the resources around us that are going to help us do that. So we just can't any longer tolerate thinking about caring labor as something that is secondary, as something that can be exploited and shouldered mainly by women and the poor, and especially by ethnic minorities when it is being paid for. However, we conclude...
Just one more minute, Lynn.
Yeah, one more minute more, hopefully, and we've lined up with the LEAP manifesto in the US and other things that surely in this moment of rupture, in the wake of COVID-19, we ought to be able to acknowledge more easily what's always been true, which is our mutual interdependency and our shared vulnerabilities. And we see that, of course, in Black Lives Matters. We see it in relation to all those trying to do something about the refugee struggles. So we're arguing for a type of universal care on every scale of life, being able to care for each other in our families and most intimate situations, but saying that absolutely depends on the infrastructures around us that enable us to do that, which in turn depend upon a sort of green politics that creates a world that is genuinely livable, that we are all able to enjoy. So all that, it seems to me, is simply obvious, and that's what we're saying in the manifesto. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lynn. Really great to have that description of the plural crises of care that surround us, and to start us thinking about what local government can do to rectify that and to give care and the work of care its due value. Also nice that you picked on a similar theme to Hilary, which is that part of local government's role is to enhance and support the social bonds that already exist in society. The state doesn't have to do everything itself, but it has to support the work that's being done. Matt Brown's just said that his internet connection is having a bit of trouble, so we might wait for a moment before hearing from Matt. So in the meantime, I'm going to move on to Joe Billsborough, who's going to talk to us about transport, obviously a key responsibility for local government. So yeah, 5 minutes, Joe, take it away.
Yeah, okay, thanks for having me, and I'll try and keep it short. So the main focus of my talk, the sole focus of my talk, is going to be on transport. And I think the key sort of overarching theme that I want to draw upon is the fact that mobility is an inherently political and politically contested thing. And it's not just a question of how we move, but also of why we move. What are the forces and dynamics that make us go around the urban or rural environments in which we live? We can see this in a really big way right now with all the debates about going back to work. So what I'm going to do is talk briefly through what I sort of see as the main problems with the transport system as we have it now, then tee things up, hopefully, for the group discussions by sort of setting out the contours a little bit of what I think might be some solutions or some interesting things to talk about. So I would argue that the issue with the transport system we face currently is there's a sort of twofold problem, right? So private transport, and I'm talking here predominantly about the use of cars, is deeply, deeply inequitable. But public transport as a sector and as a service has basically been almost completely privatized across much of the UK, with some slight exceptions in London, which I'll touch upon if there's time. If we look at car ownership first, it maps incredibly strongly, as you might imagine, onto both asset ownership and income. And these are the two things, like asset ownership and the ownership of wealth is a big focus of the sort of new left economics movement. So there's a few statistics on this. 90% of homeowners own a car. It's less than 50% of tenants in council housing. And we see the same picture with income. So less than half of people in the bottom 20% of earnings own a car, compared to over 90% of the 20% richest earners in the country. So access maps onto wealth and income. And the car is a very empowering thing, although of course it has terrible environmental consequences. But the other issue with private transport is that it sort of, by being able to drive a car, you are richer than other people in society. But the negative impacts of doing so hit on the poorest. So if you are poorer in this country, you're more likely to be hit by a car, involved in a traffic accident, suffer from air pollution, noise pollution, and also something known as community segregation, which is basically where the amount of traffic outside your home means that it's very difficult for you, particularly people with mobility issues, actually sort of be part of your local community. It's very difficult to access services or access the shops. So the ownership structure of private transport is one whereby those with the most already gain the benefits. The downsides, both social and health-based, are predominantly put upon the poorest in society. So what about public transport then? Well, the ownership structure here, and particularly the political and legal context that's evolved in sort of recent decades across the UK, means it's effectively run for the benefit almost entirely of private firms. So we have massive, massive dividends being paid out to shareholders. So every year for the last decade, on average, bus companies paid out something around £150 million a year in dividends, and train companies paid out over £200 million in dividends last year alone. But relatedly, we're also seeing, and this is even before the impact of coronavirus, massive cuts to service provision, increasing cancellations. So buses, for example, since 2010, over 3,000 routes have been cut or cancelled. And on top of which, the legal context in which all of this takes place outside of London is that local authorities at the moment are very disempowered. They don't have the power to set routes or fares. So we end up with this disconnected, expensive, and very extractive system where it's relatively common in Manchester, where I live, people to have to take 2 or 3 different buses, all with different operators, over the course of one day. And unfortunately, I don't have a sort of simple answer to how we solve these problems, but hopefully that's something we can speak through. But it's a difficult nut to crack because of the legal context and the sort of encasement of property rights within the UK. So there's a piece of legislation passed in 2017 which made it illegal to form municipal bus companies. So the best thing we can do in particular areas at the local level is to lobby your elected representatives to implement a franchising system. It's not where we want to go. It's not the sort of the final goal, but it makes things a hell of a lot better. And it would basically turn the transport network in a place into one much more like that in London. So there's an Oyster card, and the local authority has the power to set routes and so on and so forth. But that's also kind of technocratic, and I'm not sure it's fully grappling with the situation where we're facing right now. So I think what I would sort of close by saying is that I think that there's a impetus on us in the light of coronavirus to sort of get out into our communities and change the strategic terrain for this discussion. We've got these two things sort of rubbing into each other, right? Where we need to get people out of cars because of climate change. Coronavirus means they can't go onto public transport. So the market liberal, neoliberal approach, I think, and we can see this already in some places, is going to say, well, no one's on the buses. Let's just close them down. Let's cut the routes. We need to make savings. This is very short-termist, and it means, again, that the poorest in society are going to suffer, whilst those with more money will be able to go out and sort of buy a brand spanking new car. And I think we need to be sort of winning the argument in our communities and more widely within the left and across the country that, yes, coronavirus is going to mean that the public transport system is probably going to lose money over the next few years, but we should reconceptualize the way we view it so that it's seen as a genuine public service where we don't care about profit maximization. We care about having something which is green and inclusive and lets people get around and is reliable and cheap. And this, I think, can, if you take this kind of discussion into the community, I think you can really reconceptualize what it is that transport is for, because in many places now, the amount of closures mean that, I'm just seeing the comments coming through, that in many places what we're seeing is that the sort of sole routes that survive are the ones that get you into the city centre where you can't afford to live because rent is too expensive, and then back out at the end of the day. So I think the question, and I'll sort of close with the question, is what would a 21st century, genuinely public, genuinely municipal, genuinely inclusive transport system look like?
Thank you, Joe. That was really, really interesting. I mean, I think that this tension between money being drained out of services in the form of dividends alongside massive cuts to service provision, that's going to be something that I think Matt will probably touch on in his discussion of community wealth building, alongside this impetus to change the way the discussion is framed, to come up with new goals and new objectives. So next, we're going to hear from Councillor Matthew Brown, who's a leader of Preston Council. Really excited to have you with us, Matt. Hopefully the internet connection is good enough to hear you. So you've got 5 minutes. Take it away.
Yeah, hi everyone. If there's any issues with the connection, please let me know in the chat box, because the broadband needs to be nationalised, because I'm having a bit of an issue at home with the privatised system that we all rely on. So I want to talk about community wealth building. So what it is, in a nutshell, it's a fast-growing economic development movement that strengthens our communities through broadening democratic ownership and control over businesses and jobs. So there's dozens of Labour councils and mayors that are on this agenda now, and it crucially is looking at who owns the economy. So it's putting the concept of common ownership back into what Labour councils are doing, and even other councils as well. So in that respect, it's really exciting, because if you go back 15 or 20 years or even 10 years, those conversations weren't taking place at all. So it's quite an exciting time to be involved in this, really. So it's really responding to the systemic failures of corporate capitalism, because it's responding mainly to the 2008 economic recession, which was not a UK phenomenon, it was actually an international phenomenon. It started in America, went over to Europe, it even hit Africa and other places, and it was a systemic issue in the way that the global economy is structured, in the sense it works in the interests of the very wealthy, doesn't it? And there's been deregulation of the financial sector, privatisation and other things, and that hits communities. It's bound to hit communities, and it hit us most in 2008 when we had the global economic crash. And in the UK, there was £20,000 per family that was used to support the banking system. And if that amount of our money is used to support the economy, what is going to happen? You're going to have austerity. So obviously in Preston, we had very much a double whammy, in the sense that we managed to win power in 2011. I was in the executive of the council. We're very excited, but for over 10 years, we've been pursuing conventional economic development strategies. So that was trying to bring in big developers, large corporations to the community. When the economic crash came, after more than 10 years of trying to pursue that goal, which I wasn't personally in favour of, but that was consensus back then. The scheme was abandoned in Preston that would hopefully brought that investment in. And then government's cutting back with austerity every year. So you win power as a Labour council, but you're restrained, you're in a straitjacket, because the Tories don't give you any powers, and then they're cutting back on what you can spend each year. So we thought, how do we try and get out of this as far as we can? And we're trying to create economic democracy within our community. So it's a number of strategies. So it's things like encouraging employees to pay the real living wage. It's getting the council to work with other big institutions that aren't going to get up and leave, like conventional corporations, so that's universities and hospitals. Try to get them to spend a lot more within the local economy. And in Preston, the council and the rest of the public sector are spending an extra £75 million at least a year on goods and services with local businesses. And that's supporting SMEs instead of the large corporations that tend to win lots of these contracts. So it's doing that. It's looking at where we invest, not just as a council, but with our pension fund, but also with our partners. Can they shift their investment strategies to invest more in the local economy? And our public pension fund is investing a little less in equities and a little more in the local economy, building flats for students and also refurbishing an old hotel as well. So again, it's trying to bring that democracy and that local investment to the local economy. But it's very radical in the sense that in Preston, we're establishing 10-year worker-owned cooperatives. So we're establishing businesses that will be owned by the people who work within them. It's looking at building municipal ownership. So we're going to build a very large cinema restaurant development. They'll be in the ownership of the city. So the profit goes back to the community. It's looking at insourcing services, not just the council, but with our partners. We've insourced activity back into the local authority. So is the local police, so is the local housing association. And then it's looking at banking, because we're establishing alternatives to the large corporate banks that cause this mess in the first place. Because we all put our money in the large banks, that wealth leaves the community, it goes down to the square mile, and it ends up in a tax haven. And the large banks are even withdrawing from our high street, shutting branches. So establishing a regional cooperative bank in the northwest, and Preston's leading on this with partners as well. So we want to create alternatives. And then it's looking at other things like municipal energy, we're working on that, and community land trusts, and even very practical things like saying to the hospital, why don't you try and recruit people in the areas of highest deprivation, and also recruit people who might be of a BME background and other hard to reach groups, to try and increase the health by giving them real living wage jobs. So it's a very exciting set of policies that we're pursuing with a number of institutions, but it's helped us be assessed the most improved city for good economic growth in 2019 by PricewaterhouseCoopers Demos. And these policies put together have made Preston as the highest employment rate and lowest levels of economic activity for over 15 years. But the community wealth building movement, we've got Joe with us from Cles, we just heard from before. It's taking place in a number of places: Newham, Islington, the Welsh Assembly, Wirral, Sandwell, North Ayrshire, Hackney, the north of Tyne, they're all on this agenda about who owns the local economy and putting more democratic ownership and control in the hands of the people rather than corporations that tend to extract wealth out of the area. But crucially as well, it's inspired by alternatives that have been successful. So please, a bit of homework, Google the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. So if you don't think there are alternatives to capitalism, there are, because in that vast region of Spain, you've got 120 worker-owned businesses with a turnover of 25 billion euros. And there's a bank, there's retail, there's supermarkets, there's universities, industry, and they're all in the ownership of the workers. And the wages are 20 to 30% higher than shareholder-owned firms. Life expectancy in those communities are usually 1 or 2 years higher. And the gap between top and bottom pay in the companies is maximum between 1 and 9 between the chief executive and the lowest paid employee. So we're working with Mondragon to establish worker-owned cooperatives in Preston, and it's a really exciting time to be involved in this kind of agenda. But crucially, these ideas came from the American Rust Belt. So community wealth building strategies are being employed in places like Cleveland that have created around 400 jobs in a number of worker cooperatives which supply the local not-for-profit university and hospital. And New York, just a couple of weeks back, launched a community wealth building strategy. So a lot of American cities are under democratic control are becoming quite radical and openly socialist in believing that, you know, we've got to move beyond the systemic failures of capitalism and create an alternative for grassroots upwards locally. So there's that international dimension that's becoming more powerful. So this then fits into the reality we face, and I'll conclude very quickly. Obviously, we've had an economic crash in 2008. From that, we had 10 years of austerity. There's been many victims of that. But as we're just getting over that, we then have this pandemic, which has been a real collective trauma for all of us. And, you know, we've got to take this opportunity to actually build that better. And community wealth building is going to be a big part of that. Divesting from fossil fuels, investing locally, looking at public ownership of energy as far as we can, looking at, you know, community energy and other strategies, and even worker-owned and employee-owned businesses that potentially might be involved in retrofitting from the little money the government's going to give us to pursue this agenda. So the idea is we create our own economic model locally and our own infrastructure, and then get community support for these ideas. So obviously trade unions and the voluntary sector and local churches, mosques and other religious organisations are getting behind these ideas as well, because obviously it fits in with a spiritual tradition around, you know, it's very hard to become spiritually enlightened if you're stuck in poverty a lot as well. And obviously humanist organisations as well are very supportive of it too. So thanks for listening, and I'll be back later to take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. That was it's a really amazingly inspiring story, what's happened in Preston, and those international examples that Matt gave us as well. I really think this should be a model for Labour councils across the country, and it's something we should all be fighting for in the local elections next year. If TWT stands for anything, it's the idea that there are alternatives and that we can do things differently. And Preston is real living proof of that at the moment. So obviously we've got one last speaker. So Alessio is going to join us to talk about the nighttime economy. Obviously local councils have control over licensing for pubs, clubs and the nightlife in general. And the nighttime economy can play a really crucial role in local economic development. And I'm really excited for Alessio to share some of his thoughts about what municipal socialism in that area would look like. So 5 minutes, Alessio, take it away.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Matteo. So I hope that my intervention will also serve as a bridge with some of the issues highlighted in the previous interventions. So tonight I present why and how we can think about nighttime in municipalist terms. And my view is that a lot of the issues of inequalities related to nighttime, so think about closures of nighttime venues such as clubs and pubs, or the conditions of people working at night. Think about nurses or cleaners, people working in restaurants and bars. These are issues driven by discourses about economic democracy. And you heard from Matthew in the last intervention about that. So the problem, if you want, is that in order to address these type of inequalities, we have to democratize the night. So in my presentation, I refer to democracy as a problem of equality and inequality. And when I talk about nighttime, I'm particularly thinking about the impact of the financialization of cities and housing projects on the nighttime economy. And my argument is that the financialization of cities impact especially popular nighttime economies, such as those linked to racialized and migrant communities, and as a result is increasing inequalities and undermining urban democracy. So as an example of what I'm trying to say, I would like to share with you one quick story from London, the city where I live, but I encourage you to think about similar examples in your own city. And the story is the story of two nighttime venues that occupy the arches of Elephant Road in Lambeth, a Labour council in South London. Elephant Road is at the center of a very contested project by a developer group called Delancey. And this project sees the demolition of the Elephant and Castle shopping center, the construction of almost 1,000 new homes, a new business and leisure space, a new campus for London College of Communication, and it will also redevelop Elephant and Castle tube and train station. By doing that, is also impacting, all the businesses, not only in the shopping center, but along the arches of Elephant Road. And one of these businesses is Distriandina, which is a salsa club set up by the Quintero family in 2002, which is also known, with its second name, The Colombian. And Distriandina is one of the largest Latin American nightclubs in London and is very, very popular with people from South America. Now you have also its neighbor, Corsica Studios, is another very popular nightclub in London. Yeah, they're one next to each other. So as part of the station upgrade, Distriandina will have to relocate along with more than 100 independent businesses in the Red Line for relocation. But today they still have not entered a new place. And now obviously with the pandemic, Distriandina will, like many other businesses, very likely have to shut down. And later we can have a discussion about the details of the story and the impact of the pandemic on nighttime economies more in general. Anyway, on the other hand, Corsica Studio, which is, was left out from this Red Line, and is also a club that caters for a wider audience, we receive by the developer, by Delancey, £125,000 for soundproofing, from the same developer that is behind the demolition of the market. So anti-gentrification activists that are active in Elephant and Castle pointed out, and rightly so, that there is a sort of institutional racism that is saving some clubs at the expense of more working class and migrant clubs. So let's move now to some conclusions. It's very hard to stay in the 5 minutes, but so how do we move into the practice of democratizing the night? So here I have, I suggest two propositions. So the first proposition, which is at the level of economic democracy, is that we should look at tools such as community wealth building if we want to find solutions to protect and foster popular night economies. Venues that are affected by regeneration plans should be able to participate in all the decisions that affect them. And also, if regeneration plans would be clearly focused on the local community, we could have what in economic terms are called, local economic multipliers. We could also think about these nighttime venues as a sort of nocturnal commons to better understand how clubs play a critical role in building community wealth. My second proposition, and this is, if you want, on a more utopian scale, but I'll say anyway, is that we can even imagine creating a nightlife parliament instead of having the nighttime czar and the nighttime commission we have here in London. And a nightlife parliament could advocate for the formation of assemblies for matters related to nighttime, including, for instance, something very important such as data sovereignty of the interactions between the city people and nighttime infrastructures. So to conclude, what I wanted to say really is that the financialization of cities and housing is eroding the right to the city, but also the right to the city's nighttime. And municipalizing and democratizing the night can be seen as one of the struggles against this erosion of the right to the city. And we can have later a discussion about that. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Alessio. That was really fantastic. Really interesting to see how your ideas kind of interlink with the contributions we've had from other speakers this evening. So thank you again just to all of our speakers. We've covered 4 principal areas of municipal socialism: social care, public ownership of transport, community wealth building, and democratizing the night. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to break up into smaller groups of 4 or 5. And I want us to kind of discuss these ideas and discuss the different elements of municipal socialism and what they might mean to us and to our communities. So I've got kind of 4 questions which might help us structure that discussion. So first, how do these different ideas relate to your own experiences and your own communities? The second question is how you think those ideas would need to be adapted to your local area. If you live in a rural area, obviously the transport needs are very different to people who live in big cities. The final 2 questions are more strategic. So which areas do you think are in need of more policy development? The point of these policy labs is for us as kind of members of the public to try and flesh out and develop these policies. So which of them at the moment do you think need more work and more focus? And finally, this will preempt the question which we're going to have a vote on right at the end, but which is the area that you think TWT should focus the next Policy Lab session on? So we're going to have about half an hour. Luckily, all our speakers stuck to time. I was clearly scary enough that they stuck to the limits I set them. So we're going to have half an hour, and at about 7:30 we'll come back together. So each group will have a facilitator. So you'll have someone to talk you through the process and to try and get the discussion going. So we're going to break out into those groups right now, and I'll see you all again at 7:30.
View the full TWT20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.